I'm Jenni Barclay. I'm a professor of volcanology in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia. So once an eruption has started, there's a lot of challenges for communication, and you see that across eruptions worldwide. So where we've experienced this, one of the big challenges is the fact that an eruption is not necessarily something that's going to be a single thing. Volcanoes can do a really wide range of phenomena, and it can last for a long time. An eruption is often not just a skirmish, it's an all-out war in terms of duration. Okay, so in terms of eruptions worldwide, once an eruption's happening, very often what populations want to understand is what's going to happen next. And the challenge with communication around that is it could be a variety of different things, which the monitored signals gives us clues about. The communication is to enable populations to understand the range of things that might happen and which the most likely is. So ideally, in many volcanic situations, people should be prepared for what's going to happen and that this might go on for a while. But in terms of an ongoing eruption, communicating in this way can help them understand the range of issues that they might face, and so they can start to think about how to prepare themselves to deal with those ranges of eventualities. So if there's not effective communication, then obviously what happens is people will start to take decisions into their own hands, because everybody's got to weigh up the different risks. So there's obviously an immediate risk to your life, but there's risks to livelihoods which come into play during long-lived eruptions, for example. So people will start to make decisions that work best for them. So it's really important that we communicate the range of things that's going to happen during an eruption and what that means for the populations at risk. So we've looked at the outcomes for different populations around the world of various eruptions. And one of the most important things is that people feel very upset by the situation that they're in. They're removed from the place where they live and work. And so it's really important to help people make decisions that enable them to keep their stress levels down and to cope with those situations. Effectively, we're all in it together. So it's working together with those populations that seems to work best. So I've worked for many years in the Caribbean, and I work with a brilliant monitoring agency there at the University of the West Indies, the Seismic Research Centre. And one of the things that they do is they have long-term preparedness campaigns. And then during the moment of eruption for Soufriere St Vincent last year in 2021, they were able to build on that, but also to kind of keep communications rolling out, information, starting with education, understanding the range of things that the volcano could do, and then working with the local disaster management agency to talk about that in terms of preparedness measures that the populations could take. So one of the things that we found in our global survey of impacts of volcanic eruptions for displaced populations is that something that's really important is we think about their livelihoods. So as a specific example, if people have animals and livestock that they're taking care of, having plans in place that enable those livestock to be safe and looked after is really important in terms of the decisions that the population make in terms of going back into evacuated areas. One of the hardest things, of course, with volcanic eruptions is we're never quite sure when the eruption is going to end. We're not very good at forecasting how long an eruption is going to happen for, and it can be weeks, months, and even years. And so it's really important that people understand that this is not perhaps the same situation as, for example, a hurricane where it's going to arrive and then leave again. What we have to be prepared for is the possibility that that eruption could happen for a long time. And of course, that's why the monitoring is so incredibly important. So in terms of thinking about a future eruption, of course, it's extremely important that we monitor the volcano, because that's what can help us anticipate changes on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. But in terms of something that's really important, understanding what those risks are, working together with the communities and communicating with the communities is just as important. And often long-term preparedness really pays off in the moment of crisis too, with that kind of level of communication and trust. So in terms of preparedness, it's really important that we understand what we're facing in terms of both the most likely scenario, but also a maximum possible scenario, and how we can actually cope with that. Contingency planning, thinking through the scenarios and getting prepared for what could be quite a large movement of populations. And this is true for many volcanoes around the world. Of course, when the moment of acute emergency has passed, there's lots of things that we can do to prepare for the next eruption. So huge amounts of lessons can be learnt from how that eruption proceeded and where things didn't go quite to plan. And that's the moment when you can start to think about the plans for a future eruption and think about how you might be able to adapt them. And one of the things from projects that we've been involved in other locations around the world is that it's really important to work in collaboration with the communities who've been at risk, because it's they themselves who understand what it feels like, what it is to face some of the challenges from that eruption, and that can be used to help improve planning for future eruptions. Because of course it's important to save lives, but what we find with our global survey was that actually quite often lives are lost around volcanoes when they last for a long time, and people actually take actions to preserve their livelihoods as well. So thinking about communities and communities at risk, lives in the round is a really important part of preparing for the next eruption. Of course, in that acute moment of an emergency, the absolute priority is to save lives. But often eruptions go on for many days and weeks, and a really important way to help keep population prepared is to talk about what might happen next. And in many agencies around the world, we talk about this in terms of scenarios, what the most likely scenario is, what an unexpected scenario could be. And these help populations imagine what might happen next. Of course, with lots of education about how volcanoes erupt and what they do. Because something we don't often think about is that volcanoes do a lot of different things, and each of these can pose individual risks to different types of population. In terms of our global analysis of people who've lost lives recently from volcanic eruptions around the world, one of the things that's clear is that people take apparently illogical risks with their life, but often what they're doing is they're acting to protect their assets or their livelihoods, or they're simply moving back towards their home because that's where they understand and feel safe. One of the really big challenges that we've got with volcanic eruptions is, in some instances, they don't erupt very often. So we have to be prepared over long periods of time where it's quite difficult for people to imagine what might happen. So what we've found from the projects we've been involved in is that working in collaboration with the communities and with those people who are involved in monitoring or managing the risks is really important to understand all the different perspectives, to think about how we can embed it in education, to think about how we can embed preparedness for volcanic eruptions into people's everyday lives. Yeah. Okay. Yep. So this poster summarises some of the key findings from our Striva project, which is about strengthening resilience in volcanic areas. And these two graphs kind of make the point that in the last 30 years or so, many people who died are actually just acting to preserve their livelihoods. So the volcano had been erupting for a long time, and things had caused them to go back into zones that they might not otherwise have been into. So for example, looking after crops or livestock, or actually just being where they wanted to live. And one of the other points, I guess, is that we have to really think about saving lives, of course, but in terms of volcanic eruptions, so many more people are disrupted by them. So in terms of minimising impacts, we have to think about the disruptions associated with long-term movements from volcanic eruptions. And in the long term, we find that people really, the ash has got a really long-term negative influence just on everything, including livelihoods, but also just how it feels. It's a grind to cope with ash. But by talking to local populations, we do find that they can and do adapt and cope. And this kind of summarises some of our findings from talking to farmers in Ecuador. And what they decided to do was change the crops that they were growing. So for example, growing more onions, which are more robust to kind of being ashed on, whereas the sort of crops that have blossom or flowers are less robust if they're ash at that time. And they did things like changing harvest time or storing the feed for animals so they didn't get impacted by the ash. So the whole idea here is that by integrating scientific approaches with community understanding, we can improve how we prepare and cope with eruptions when they happen.